If you think the next currency war will look like armies marching, you are already late. The real battle is invisible, clinical, and intimate. It lives in systems that move money through codes you never see and rules you never voted for. You have felt it in your own life, even if you cannot name it. A payment fails and suddenly your options disappear. A platform changes a policy and your business gets throttled. A security update freezes your access at the worst moment. You tell yourself it is just inconvenience. But inconvenience is how control enters without announcing itself. Today, we are talking about Myanmar. But we are not really talking about Myanmar. We are talking about the shape of power in the 21st century. Who gets to see your transactions? Who gets to rewrite your reality while you sleep? And how a country can become a testing ground for a new financial architecture that makes old empires feel blind. Welcome to the Hidden Self. This episode is a stripped-down look at how control works when it wears the mask of technology, and how people, including regular people like you, quietly cooperate with the systems that later punish them. Let's begin with the uncomfortable premise. For more than 70 years, one currency did not just represent value, it represented permission. The world did not only trade using dollars, it traded through a dollar-shaped nervous system. And if you controlled that nervous system, you could control who lived comfortably and who suffocated. In the old model, when a company in one country wanted to buy something from another country, the transaction often had to pass through dollars first. Not because everyone loved the dollar, because the infrastructure assumed the dollar would be there. So the money moved as an instruction, using secure messaging between banks. In that network, a system called SWIFT acted like the global postal service for financial orders. It carried messages, not cash. But the message was the bloodstream of commerce. Now here is the part people keep pretending is neutral. SWIFT can be technically operated like a service, but it exists inside a geopolitical reality. The standards, the oversight, the choke points, and the enforcement environment are shaped by power. In plain language, a system can be global and still answer to one capital's priorities. So when the United States wanted to squeeze a country, it did not need to invade. It could simply tell banks to stop participating, cut access to the network, or restrict certain financial routes, and commerce collapses with frightening speed. A country that cannot reliably move money, cannot import medicine, cannot pay for fuel, cannot buy spare parts. And once the supply chain breaks, governments start doing desperate things. Rationing, inflation, barter markets, corruption, and black markets that thrive because the official channels are choked. This is the logic of lethal convenience. It feels clean, no bombs, no visible violence. But the result is the same as strangulation. Now take a rising power watching this happen repeatedly and learn the lesson from it. China looked at the world and saw something terrifying. As long as its financial throat remains in Washington's hands, it is not safe. Not strategically, not economically, not politically. So it needs an alternative route, not just a backup. A parallel architecture that can keep the flow of trade alive even when the old system is turned off. And where do you test an alternative architecture? Not in a place with stable institutions and low-risk appetite. You test it where desperation forces cooperation. You test it where political isolation creates urgency. You test it where sanctions and capital flight already make the old system unreliable. Myanmar became that place. Let's talk about why Myanmar specifically was attractive as a laboratory. After political turmoil and the return of military rule, Myanmar faced increasing pressure from Western governments. Investment flows slowed. Financial relationships tightened. International banks became cautious, not because they suddenly cared about morality, but because they feared secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions are the invisible net. Even if you are not directly targeted, you can still be punished for interacting with someone who is. So the currency weakened. Inflation surged. The country needed dollars for imports, but dollars were harder to get. Businesses could not trade normally. The regime needed resources, and the population needed basics. This created a vacuum. Then China arrived, and it did not arrive like a savior. It arrived like a surgeon offering oxygen while controlling the machine. China offered infrastructure, connectivity, trade routes, and financial pathways that did not rely on the same dollar-dependent choke points. But oxygen comes with tubing. The tubing leads somewhere, and the place it leads to is a system China wants to test, refine, and expand. This is where the story becomes technically terrifying, because the key is not only software, it is the entire stack: cables, towers, border gateways, bank channels, and settlement rules. A new money system is not launched by speeches, it is launched by hardware and logistics. China did the quiet work first. There was telecom infrastructure, networks of data highways that carry financial signals. Not just generic internet, but the controlled routes that connect remote regions into a centralized digital environment. Huawei and ZTE were heavily involved in building parts of this connectivity. The result is that financial data can flow through digital corridors that are shaped by Chinese vendors and Chinese technical standards. Then there were border systems and customs digitization. Borders are where money becomes real. When border payments and trade documentation are digitized and standardized, it becomes easier to route transactions according to the architecture of whoever built the system. Then there were the banking relationships. Chinese banks and major financial institutions established branches and direct payment channels. The stage was set, and then the main actor stepped on stage: a system of cross-border settlement that is meant to reduce dependency on the US-controlled messaging pathways, and a digital currency mechanism that can settle trades instantly without the same observable presence in Western ledgers. People often hear the terms and assume they are about convenience for consumers. That is the story they tell themselves so they can sleep. In reality, the purpose is strategic control. So what actually happens in this Myanmar-linked financial model? Imagine a company in Myanmar importing fuel or consumer goods. In the old system, it might pay in Myanmar currency, convert into dollars, settle across international banks, and then convert again into the seller's currency. The dollar conversion step creates visibility and creates leverage. It also creates dependence on the trust and participation of banks that operate under the US regulatory shadow. In the alternative model, the logic changes. First, the Myanmar business deposits local currency or a currency position like kyat into a connected wallet or banking account that is linked to the Chinese infrastructure. This is not magic. It is a channel relationship. Your money goes into a controlled corridor. Second, instead of converting through dollars at the international level, the system uses direct exchange rates between kyat and renminbi. This removes the need for dollars as an intermediate. Remove the intermediate, remove the leverage. Third, the transaction can be tokenized or instantly exchanged into a digital instrument tied to the digital currency framework. This is where the architecture tries to become hard to track by external observers who rely on the visibility created by dollar-centric flows. Fourth, the digital instrument flows across a digital border layer that is verified on ledgers controlled within the Chinese system. Verification does not mean neutral transparency. It means you are looking at a system that has its own rules and its own master keys. Fifth, the seller in China receives the digital currency settlement immediately. The trade completes without requiring the same dependence on US financial messaging pathways and without leaving the same trail in Western systems. Now ask yourself why this is frightening. Because this makes money programmable. A centralized digital framework can attach conditions to how funds can be used. It can restrict that money to certain categories. For example, funds intended for telecom equipment can be coded to be used only for that kind of procurement. Or funds can expire if not used within a window, forcing behavior. This is not only financial engineering, it is governance. In Myanmar's case, the coded restrictions can serve multiple goals at once. They can reduce opportunities for corruption or diversion. They can ensure that Chinese investment is used in ways that align with Chinese strategic interests. They can also prevent certain transactions from flowing where they are politically inconvenient. But the psychological cost is huge for the host country. Because once money is programmable in a foreign-controlled digital system, the host state loses parts of its sovereignty in exchange for liquidity. You stop being an independent actor and start being a node that obeys. And this is not limited to government elites. When money becomes centralized and coded, normal businesses and individuals become easier to predict, categorize, and constrain. You might say, so what? It is just payments. No. This is why power shifts. The old American leverage was not only about printing money, it was about data and visibility. Through international financial messaging networks, U.S. adjacent institutions could monitor flows, identify suspicious patterns, trace money trails, and enforce sanctions with precision. They could map who was financing what, who was laundering money, and how money supported extremist or sanctioned activities. If a significant share of trade moves through a parallel architecture that is less visible to U.S.-controlled systems, the American eyes lose coverage. And when the eyes lose coverage, enforcement becomes much harder. You can still apply pressure politically, but the ability to choke the flow through financial routes weakens. So the fear is real. When sanctions stop biting because the target uses a system you do not control, sanctions become blunt theater. This is where the story escalates from economics into strategy. China is building a coalition of the financially isolated, not with speeches, with infrastructure. It chooses regions that are already pushed to the margins, places facing sanctions, political isolation, and financial bottlenecks: Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, parts of Africa, Iran, Russia. The logic is to connect them into an ecosystem where trade can continue regardless of U.S. restrictions. If enough volume moves through that ecosystem, it creates its own gravitational pull. Businesses in those regions start operating in that environment because it is functional. Over time, that ecosystem can challenge the dominance of dollar-based trade settlement, sometimes called petrodollar logic, even beyond oil. And then comes the next phase. The world could fragment into currency blocks. Picture the future 10 to 20 years from now. Not a single global network, but multiple overlapping networks with different standards, different ledgers, and different rules of compliance. In one scenario, the West remains anchored in USD and euro-centered settlement, with compliance mechanisms built into the infrastructure. That side emphasizes regulatory alignment, human rights narratives, and environmental or governance standards, at least rhetorically. Whether you agree with it or not, the structure remains. Access depends on acceptance of their system. In the other scenario, an Eastern Bloc leans into renminbi-centered settlement using this alternative stack, the cross-border system, plus the digital currency settlement method. That side emphasizes state sovereignty, controlled digital infrastructure, and fast settlement efficiency, and it offers countries a route to trade without dependency on U.S. financial permission. But between these blocks, trade becomes expensive and risky. Businesses might need two systems, two sets of accounting, two operational workflows. They must manage political risk and compliance risk for each pathway. Your costs go up, your uncertainty increases, and your survival depends on choosing which architecture your counterpart trusts. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable truth. The real product being sold is not currency. It is behavioral control. Because when digital money replaces cash, privacy shrinks. Not because someone wants to spy for fun, but because centralized digital systems require records to function. And once records exist at scale, someone will use them. If a state controls the digital money layer and the infrastructure vendor controls aspects of the architecture, then the state can learn what you buy, when you buy it, where you buy it, and with whom you interact financially. That is not paranoia. That is basic transaction analytics. Now imagine this in Myanmar. If the host government or even the foreign-linked system decides someone is inconvenient, they can freeze accounts with remote commands. They do not need police raids. They do not need public trials. They just cut access to the money flow. This is the dark side of a smart financial system. It turns economic life into a conditional privilege. And it turns dissent into an administrative problem. Remove access, and people cannot live normally. People often treat this as an abstract future, but centralized digital currency models make it technically feasible. The frightening part is that once it works once, it becomes a template. Then you get domino effects. If Myanmar stabilizes enough to show that the alternative architecture can reduce sanctions pain, other sanctioned countries become tempted. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and especially Russia, under heavy restrictions, would want to speed up integration. That could reduce the share of USD in global foreign exchange reserves and trade settlement. It could also reduce the ability of the U.S. to export inflation through monetary dominance, because fewer transactions route through their system. And the U.S. is not naive. It knows its leverage is not only the printing press, it is the choke points and the monitoring. Lose visibility and enforcement becomes harder. Now, where does Vietnam fit? because you are not watching this from a safe distance. You share geography and trade routes. Myanmar borders China, and Vietnam borders shipping lanes, supply chains, and economic networks that do not stop at borders. Vietnam could benefit in the short term from a reduced payment bottleneck. If Chinese-enabled settlement makes kyat to renminbi or related conversions faster and cheaper across certain corridors, some trade along the border can be smoother. Exporters of agricultural goods could receive payments faster. Reduced friction sounds like relief, but relief is never free. This creates three traps. The first trap is choosing sides under pressure. If the US tightens restrictions and punishes banks or companies that use the Chinese parallel system for certain sanctioned entities, Vietnamese firms could become collateral. A Vietnamese company might say, "We are not against anyone, but sanctions do not care about your innocence. They care about your transaction routes." And a transaction can be interpreted as cooperation. The second trap is data sovereignty. If Vietnamese businesses use Chinese-linked digital wallets and infrastructure, consumer and transaction data can be collected, analyzed, or shared depending on agreements. Even if it is not overt spying, the data has value, and value invites monetization or strategic use. You do not get to control what you cannot see. The third trap is dependency. If the economy integrates too deeply into a foreign-controlled digital settlement layer, policymakers lose leverage. Independent monetary policy requires tools and autonomy. If your payment system is constrained by another power's architecture, your choice becomes limited. You can print domestic policy, but you cannot command the payment reality. Now listen carefully. This is not about choosing a villain and a hero. This is about understanding the mechanism. The hidden thing in this entire story is not money. It is trust and control. People say money is just a tool. That is how they avoid the real question. Who decides the rules of the tool? In the 20th century, the US wrote the standards. Money could be free, but it had to pass through their checkpoints. In the 21st century, China proposes a new standard. Money does not need to pass through the US checkpoint, but it must stay within their line of sight. Both models are control. One uses law and market dominance, the other uses technology and hard infrastructure. Myanmar is not merely a victim in the story. It is a training ground for a world order that will feel normal only after it has already been normalized. And the most tragic part is that those who suffer often help build the machine that will later suppress them, because desperation makes people bargain away rights in exchange for survival. This is where the psychology of the hidden self matters. When you are desperate, you become negotiable. You sign the terms you would otherwise reject. You accept surveillance if it keeps food on the table. You accept dependence if it keeps your payments flowing. And later, when someone asks why you did it, you pretend you had no choice. That story becomes your self-protection, your way to keep self-respect intact. But the reality is harsher. You chose survival over autonomy because survival felt urgent and autonomy felt theoretical. That is human. It is also the pattern used by every power that offers solutions to people in crisis. Now let's go deeper into how the mechanism works in the Myanmar-linked model, because the details reveal the real intent. There is a problem at the border. Converting kyat to renminbi requires liquidity. Usually,